me, this marks quite an exciting and unique opportunity because for all the years I've been interested in the wreck of the Royal Charter, and I've known that the ship was owned by the company Gibbs Bright and Company, the opportunity arose probably about 12 months ago to begin to make contact with Charles Bright, who is the great-great-grandson of one of the owners of the ship. And lo and behold, I got contact with Charles not many months ago, who happened to be at his flat in London. And so we arranged to have a meeting at the flat, and who came along to join us but Michael Gibbs, who's from the other side of the partnership families. And so this is very exciting to me. It's an opportunity I never thought would occur. And so what we're going to do now is ask some pertinent questions and hope that we get pertinent and honest answers from the two gentlemen. Okay, so I think what we'll do is begin with Charles Bright. And what I'd like you to tell me, Charles, is your knowledge of the origins of the Bright family and their interest in shipping, and how that sort of moved on over the years to the point that the two families merged, and therefore we ended up with Gibbs, Bright and Co.
Well, thank you, Peter, very much for the opportunity to firstly meet Michael Gibbs, who we haven't met before today, and it's a great excitement for my wife and I to meet him and also you. Quite a clear picture has emerged of the family over a fairly long period of time. Like most families in England, we can go back to 1066 and the invasion from France, and our family sort of started with the name Richard of Brittany, or Richard le Breton, or latterly Richard de Brito. And those three names clearly referred to the same person. But the Domesday Book of 1086 mentions land being held in the Clun area around Brockton in Shropshire on the Welsh borders. And it was from there that the family began its existence as a cohesive unit, and land for the next 400 years became the centerpiece of that activity. And around the sort of 1600s, it morphed into a family that appeared to go down the path of school mastership and university activity in an academic sense for 100 or so years. But during that period, land acquisition also occurred, this time particularly in Herefordshire. To cut a long story short, over the next sort of 100 years, Henry Bright formed partnerships with his master in an apprentice structure, and then married the only daughter of the Mailer line, and their activity commenced as shipping activists out of the Baltic Sea, around Scandinavia, and also out of America, where wood timber was brought in to begin the coopering business of the Mailer family. That expanded to trade in a far broader context, leading to the point where they became suppliers of all sorts of material, including money, to the West Indies, which was the powerhouse at that point of the British economy. And that then led to ship ownership, to the extension of loans to landholders in the West Indies, and with, on several occasions, in fact many occasions, those loans being forfeit, the security was exercised and the land acquisitions sort of commenced. At around this time, a man called Richard Bright formed a very close relationship with George Gibbs. This is about the 1770s. In the 1770s, the Gibbs family, in the form of George Gibbs Sr. And Richard Bright, formed a close association and were involved in very similar businesses. By 1818, the families merged the businesses that had great similarities in Bristol and formed Gibbs, Son and Bright. After that union was created, there's a continuous association of the families up until 1987, when the Hong Kong and Shanghai Back acquired control of Anthony Gibbs. Anthony Gibbs being, at that point, the parent company of Gibbs Bright. So the association has been a very long one, and it lasted through the period of the turbocharged industrial revolution in Britain, which began with the release of funds from the West Indies towards railways and shipbuilding. So by the middle of the 19th century, you find both families acquiring a multitude of ships. The most famous, I suspect, was the Great Britain, which was designed by Brunel, but her sister ship, the Royal Charter, was a precursor to the Great Britain and had the same parentage and the same design structures. And it was that ship that we're obviously honouring today. And at this point, I think it's appropriate that Michael Gibbs gives an undertaking or a brief overview of how the Gibbs family developed.
Charles, thanks for that. And it's really interesting to hear the long-term development of a company involved in beginning to do with things of a marine nature, marine trading, into shipping, moving on from shipping into banking, and then how the two families, the Brights and the Gibbs, came to join to form Gibbs, Bright and Company. And so thank you for what you've said, and I'm really pleased now that we're joined today by Michael Gibbs, and I look forward to hearing what Michael's got to tell us.
Great, well it's a fantastic opportunity both to meet Brights and to meet Peter and to hear all about the Royal Charter, the story behind that. If I come back to the Gibbs family, the Gibbses really, as far as we know, we can't trace ourselves back to the Norman invasion, but we do have a pretty consistent history back to about the 14th century. There's really yeoman farmers down in the south of Devon, around Dartmouth, and really they were kind of fairly lawless bunch of people who traded and farmed and had disputes. So most of our history at that stage is known through law cases and all those kind of criminal activities. I think there were cattle raiders and all kinds of things. But at a later stage, the family moved towards Exmouth and started really in the wool trade. So they were really traders in wool, and they had a cloth making mill there as well. And other members of the family from around there, from around the sort of Exmouth area, went out. Their apprentices went out to one branch of them went out to Italy. So they had members of the family who were based in Genoa, in Naples, in Sicily. They had other members of the family who were trading through Cadiz. So they were really trading a lot Exeter cloth to the Mediterranean, and then bringing back fruit, wines and other goods. So very much Mediterranean traders at a difficult time. We're talking about times when Spain and France were at war. Napoleon was careering through the country trying to create all kinds of troubles. And then Abraham Gibbs, who was one of the kind of starters really of the family, he became a surgeon. He actually became chief surgeon of Exeter, and he apprenticed his different sons to different activities. The older son, Vickery, went off to Eton, and he got a scholarship to Eton and went to Cambridge, and he became a sort of important judge. He was in the court in London, and he was quite a sort of significant person in London. And the second two sons went into into merchant trading. The older one was George. So George Gibbs was the one that went to Bristol. He apprenticed with Muckley, or Samuel Muckley, who was a merchant trader in Bristol. He apprenticed with him. The next one, Anthony, apprenticed with another company or another partner that had a lot of interest in Spain and in Cadiz, and started trading cloths out to Spain. So you had a situation where you had three main members, three men in the family. One was a powerful lawyer in London, and the other two were both merchants trying to make their way in the world. And I think it was surprisingly, it was quite a tough business in those days. George in Bristol was really very successful. His partnership, his friendship with the Brights really flourished, and he did pretty well in his merchant banking, his merchant trading. The one who was actually best known and whose business eventually really excelled was Anthony, who was a bit more of a maverick and extremely optimistic about things, and traded in Spain, and got his father, George, who by this time, or Abraham by this time, was hoping to retire a nice peaceful country life. He got him to back him a lot and support him a lot with money. But actually, at the age of about 30, he went bankrupt and took his father down as well. His father went bankrupt as well. George and Vickery supported him a bit, but actually went through some very hard times. And he decided the only way he could make good was to go back out to Spain and try and build up the contacts there and build up the trading contacts. So in fact, he became a kind of a contact for George Gibbs's shipping to then import goods from Spain and the Mediterranean countries, and also with the Italian connections. And it was, I guess, one of his most intriguing ventures, which really started that part of the family's real links beyond the European world, was Spain and France were at war at that time, and Britain was at war with Spain. So there was a blockade on Spanish ports, and Anthony persuaded Vickery to intercede on his part in London and get to the British Navy to allow a ship to go through the blockade. So he hired a ship called the Hermosa Mexicana. He hired a Spanish ship called the Hermosa Mexicana and got the British Navy to allow it to pass, and took the ship to Lima with all the spare goods that he couldn't sell in Spain. And that really started the family's links with Latin America. And although that particular venture, I think, probably just about broke even, the family, my branch of the family, the Anthony Gibbs family, became very big in trading with Latin America. And what really made their money was they got an exclusive contract with the Peruvian government for importing guano for fertilizer into Europe. And that made them, Anthony died before this, but it made his sons extremely rich. So William Gibbs, who was his main son, Anthony Gibbs's son, became one of the richest commoners in Britain through importing bird poo. There was a ditty in London saying Mr. Gibbs made his dibs selling the turds of foreign birds. And out of that acquired Tinsfield, which is now a National Trust property. So that branch of the family became very wealthy through that. The business then actually passed on to George's oldest son, and through that line, through George's son, we actually go right down to more recently David Gibbs, who partnered with Charles's father, and the two of them together were the partners of the business in Australia until the time that it was sold to HSBC. So the family's been involved in trading and banking really through that time, from the late 1700s through until the late 80s when they sold out to HSBC. So I think that gives an overview of the family connections.
Yep.
I can talk a little bit about, so my great-great-grandfather, John Lomax Gibbs, so traditionally, whereas the oldest members went into merchant trading and banking, the sort of younger sons went into the church. So my great-great-grandfather was John Lomax Gibbs, who was a country parson really, but he married Isabel Bright. So he created the first, I think it was the first direct family link, relationship between the Bright and Gibbs families. One of his sons then married another Bright, and there was also one of his daughters married the daughter of another Bright relationship. So there was quite close family links in that way. And I think there was also quite a lot of exchanges of Gibbses going out to Australia to spend time with that branch of the family, and Brights coming to London to work with the Gibbs firm in London. So there's always been quite a strong link between the two families in that way.
So we've had two interesting stories on the beginnings of the company. We've had Charles telling us about the Brights and Michael telling us about the Gibbs. And slowly the two have merged together until we reach the point of having the company Gibbs Bright. Moving on from there, obviously today we're here to talk about the Royal Charter. And the Royal Charter began construction, as Chris has told us, on the slipway on the River Dee at a place called Shotton. The ship was being built for Charles Moore and Company, the owners of the first White Star Line. Sadly for Charles Moore and Company, they had just had built a ship called the Taylor, which was built on the river at Warrington, and on the maiden voyage of the Taylor, she hit rocks off Dublin and was lost. Because of the nature of insurance, the result of that loss was Charles Moore and Company going bankrupt. And so the Royal Charter on the stocks at Shotton had to be sold. And the buyers were Gibbs Bright and Company. Gibbs Bright and Company spoke to William Patterson, the designer and the builder, and they put various changes in hand to have the ship lengthened. And so I would like to ask Charles Bright to come back and tell us the story as far as they're concerned from that point onwards.
This is an interesting opportunity, I guess, to further highlight the entrepreneurial spirit of the age, where business practices were fluid, opportunities were presented, action was taken, and sometimes disasters ensued, but hopefully more often than not the consequences were beneficial to the practitioners. I say this because just prior to the Royal Charter in the prologue that Peter referred to, Gibbs Bright was involved in the Great Britain, which was the major ship that Brunel built as the extension of the moving of people from London to New York, where the Great Britain was designed to act as a train and pick up from the Great Western Rail Company the passengers that would come from London to go to Bristol, and then to move from Bristol to New York in the Great Britain. And the Great Britain, the Gibbs and the Brights, and Gibbs Bright in particular, were major shareholders at this point, at the early stages of the Great Britain, when it was built and launched to enormous fanfare in 1843, and at a significant overrun of costs of about £97,000 at the time. On its second voyage, the Great Britain was returning from New York and ran aground at Dundrum Bay in Ireland. It lay there for 3 years, and Gibbs Bright then bought the company as a wreck, basically, on Dundrum Bay for £17,000, and got 45 years of use on the Australia Britain run from Bristol and Liverpool to Melbourne, fueling essentially the gold rush which had just begun in Melbourne. So soon after that event had taken place, this opportunity arose in relation to the Royal Charter, and for all the obvious reasons, Gibbs Bright decided to attempt to repeat their good fortune in the Royal Charters case that they'd experienced with the Great Britain. Is that right, Danny? The timing's right, isn't it? Okay. So, does it stop there? Is that a break position?
Yeah, can do.
Or more on the Royal Charter. Everyone knows about the disaster.
Successful runs it before.
Well, yeah, but don't forget the Royal Charter was bought and was launched in 1855. 1859, it went, 4 trips later, it went aground. So it was a very short-lived.
Big life of,
Yeah, maybe you can say something about that.
Maybe what you could also go into
Record-breaking
is
run.
the after the wreck, the salvage, and how Gibbs Bright took ownership
Okay.
back.
We'll come back to that as well. Okay, Tim, let's just do just a bit more. You ready?
Yep.
Yeah. It's interesting to remember that the Royal Charter, having been acquired in extremely beneficial circumstances, was launched again with great fanfare and began its passages to Australia in 1855 and turned out to be an extremely successful transporter of immigrants and gold hunters to Melbourne. In record time, 60 days was the average period for the voyage, which of course was an extraordinarily fast passage. And the disaster that occurred on the 25th of October 1859 was an appallingly quick end to what everybody had hoped to be a long and successful career for both boat and obviously for the owners. Subsequent to the wreck, which was had enormous sort of consequences in the very short term to the company, and particularly to Samuel Bright, who was the resident partner in Liverpool at the time. The rescue of the people, the consequences of the disaster, all were extremely difficult to bear, records show, by that part of the family and by the company as a whole. It's interesting to note that the Lloyd's, the insurance company, in 1860 sold the wreck back to Gibbs Bright for £1,000, and the subsequent activity over the next 3 or 4 years remained very active as the company was managing the further recovery and attempting to clean up what had been one of the most disastrous marine events in British history.
Of course, about the Royal Charter is that the ship was built of iron. And I'm going to interrupt the sort of flow of what we're doing here, because we've heard from 2 very fine men, but as we all know, behind very fine men there is usually a very fine woman. And a lot of this story has been catalogued in a book which is going to be published by Charles' wife, Primrose, or as Charles would call her, Primmy. And I would like to ask her to tell me again the story about the ship owner's son who commissioned the building of a ship made out of iron, because the father, of course, had lived with timber. And here comes his knowledgeable son, knowing perhaps in his old mind how things were going to change, and he commissioned the building of a ship built out of iron.
I'm Charles's wife, Primmy, and I've been fascinated by this family for over 40 years now. And we're talking now about the Royal Charter, but the Great Britain was the forerunner in iron shipbuilding. And of course she was different in every way, so I'll start with her. Her iron construction was of a material so foreign to shipbuilding as to cause grave concern from all but her enthusiastic investors. Richard Bright of Ham Green, Robert Bright's father, Robert being the family member who was on the board of the Great Western Railway Company and of course the Great Britain, Richard Bright, his father, wrote to Robert in 1838, 14 months before his death, in complete dismay at what he had heard by rumour, as follows. Although I have not yet mentioned the subject to you, not having had a clear opportunity of doing so since it came absolutely to my knowledge, yet it has not ceased to give me uneasiness to learn, in a manner which gave me no room to doubt, that the steamship concern had entirely changed their views in respect to their second ship, that the preparations for saw pits and other necessary conveniences for the timber constructions of such a vessel had not only ceased, but they were actually filling up the saw pits and destroying the other conveniences already in progress, under an absolute determination of the company to substitute iron and rivets in the place of oak and oakum, and blacksmiths to supplant ship's carpenters and sawyers. It certainly much surprised me, and it has not ceased to distract my mind during my waking, vigilant hours, and such as during the night would have been better employed in sleep and comfort. I know not, nor did I ever inquire the detailed end of the concern, for I really did not believe that the caution of some, who I supposed with yourself would not have more than counterbalanced the supporters of such a wild and improvident project. Although it may not now even be carried into effect, it is but little consolation to me that it may not be carried into effect during the short remaining period of my life, unless I could see that such influence had ceased to operate. The particular causes of my great alarm I will not now enter into. They might have been useful as cautionary, but I find it is now too late to use them. I can therefore now earnestly pray that my solicitude may prove to be completely unfounded. Although it is very painful to me to give you any uneasiness of strong doubts, I fear, which the more I repeat the greater I experience, I cannot refuse to myself the compliance with what I feel a strong conviction to be my duty to warn you, my dear son, and your family. Robert replied to his father on the same day, apologizing for his thoughtfulness in not discussing the iron ship with him before this. But as soon as we had settled on it, it passed my mind as a thing done with. He goes on to say, I have not the least doubt of our being quite right, and that after a few years, iron steamers, if not merchant ships, will supersede all timber ships. My friends Brunel, Patterson, the engineers, and the boat builders unite in recommending it. There follows a note from Richard Bright. On receipt of the above, I wrote but did not send this note in reply. I have no doubt but that you were satisfied before you assented to the proposal of a change from timber to iron. But even all the scientific authorities you quote will not convince me that the experiment is not one of great imprudence, and I still must lament your better discretion has been overpowered without, as I must yet believe, your cool judgment being concerned. Magnetic influence, accident, repair in foreign countries, all seem to have been unthought of, but if thought of, more the indiscretion. And that is Richard Bright's letters, which are held in the University of Melbourne archives. in Melbourne, Australia.
Right, well, thank you for that, Primrose. It's a very interesting point, because here we have the younger man looking at more modern materials, and the father being very entrenched in the use of traditional materials. I'll just break into this point to say that not many days ago I took 2 grandsons to Jodrell Bank, and the topic that we heard by an expert was on pulsars, and I knew nothing about pulsars. I know a little bit more now, but not much. But at the end of the session, children aged 10, 11 and 12 were asking questions, the topic of which even the lecturer, a renowned professor of astroscience, had never even touched on those subjects when he was their age. And so here we are with younger people coming up with more modern knowledge, and here we have the son wanting to go into modern materials of building the ships. And yes, as you said, Primrose, there was a concern of the effect of the iron ship on the magnetic steering compass. And this was highlighted on the maiden voyage of the Royal Charter, because on the maiden voyage of the Royal Charter we had the Reverend Dr. William Scoresby, rector of St Mary's Church, Whitby. Not only was he reverend, but he was also a doctor of science, and his main interest in life was magnetism. And he went on the maiden voyage of the Royal Charter to study the effects of the iron ship's hull on the ship's magnetic steering compass. Now, as an incidental thing, what a joy it is to have here today what is known as the Scoresby chair. The Scoresby chair is made out of timber recovered from the wreck of the Royal Charter, and the people of Whitby bought the wood and had the commemorative chair, the Scoresby chair, made, and that normally sits in St Mary's Church, Whitby, but thank you very much to them for lending it to us. Here we have it today for everyone to look at. As I said earlier, behind every fine man there is a fine lady, and particularly in this case, the history of the Bright family and the connection with the Gibbs family has been researched and researched, not so much by Charles, but by his wife Primrose. And Primrose, through her efforts, has produced this history of the family. And this is quite a substantial volume. But of course, this isn't the complete works, because we also have volume 2 added to that. And not satisfied with what she had collected so far, we then have volume 3. And these are soon to be published, and I'm sure it's going to be avid reading by everybody to know all about this fantastic family, which for us has such a tremendous connection with Moylvra in North Wales.